Um, there's a lot going on, right? In government these days, and we'll get to that, but mostly here you've got a room full of law students. And I wonder if you could start by setting the scene and just telling them what's the role of the general counsel of HHS?
Yeah, I used to know the answer to that question. Now I don't really know. But I'll tell you what I think the role ideally is. And I'll just say, first of all, thank you, Karen, for hosting this. And it's just so great to be back here. I really enjoyed being a member of this faculty. Being Karen's colleague through the years was just incredible. And the work that she does to bring in speakers is amazing. And thank you for those words. I will say I was incredibly lucky as HHS General Counsel to be able to bring in a number of really terrific people, very much including Rachel. One of the things that academics get a bad reputation for is being sort of high in the sky, not being very practical people. We brought in Rachel to work on implementing some incredibly difficult, intricate, and extremely practical initiatives, particularly IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act's drug price negotiation program, which was a historic program that had all kinds of just incredibly hard legal questions, but also hard implementation questions. And if we hadn't had Rachel, we wouldn't have been able to do it. I mean, I just want to say anything Rachel wants me to do, I owe her, and we'll do it. And coming here to my old home to talk to students here is the easiest thing to ask me to do. So I just wanted to get all that out of the way before actually answering the question. Ideally, what should a general counsel be in a government agency? The thing is, like lawyers, their job should be to make sure that government operates well and in accordance with law, right? That's fundamentally your role as a government lawyer, not as like a litigating government lawyer, a DOJ kind of person, a prosecutor, something like that, but as an in-house government lawyer, what you want to do is make sure the government's working and make sure the government is acting according to law. Most of the time, in an ordinary administration, the act in accordance with law piece is you want to make sure that people understand what the outer boundaries are on what they might do. They pretty much know what the outer boundaries are most of the time, and they pretty much don't want to exceed them. And so then where the life gets interesting as an in-house government lawyer is the way you're analyzing and advising about risk. That I can make a perfectly good, plausible legal argument for the thing you want to do, but let me tell you what these courts will say, what these challenges will be, what these folks, these other legal actors might say, like the Government Accountability Office or someone like that. And here's how likely it is that bad things might happen if you push this. And just so you know, those are the things that might happen. Are you still willing to do the thing you want to do, you originally wanted to do? Or do you want to think about how we might do this in a way that reduces those risks? And you try to engage the government client just like you would a private client in a conversation where they're really seriously considering what are the benefits of the pathway they want to choose and what are the risks, and are there ways of essentially getting all or most of the benefits while mitigating the risks. Now these days, I don't know I think the lawyers are being cut out almost entirely of the conversations. And so I don't know what those folks are doing, except potentially being weaponized to go after people, which is not what I would have signed up for and certainly not what I did sign up for.
And so I love your use of the word in-house to refer to your time at HHS. And you had been previously at DOJ, which is more maybe external facing, right? Litigation. And so law students, a lot of the time, right? They read cases, right? They understand the process of litigation and the idea. So can you talk a little bit more maybe about at HHS, what's the sort of range of federal programs the agency oversees? What's their importance to the American people?
Yeah, I mean, HHS is the most significant domestic agency in the federal government. $1.8 trillion annual budget, so the biggest budget of any of the cabinet agencies. You know, HHS and DOD kind of fight over which is the biggest because DOD has more personnel, but HHS has more money. So I always said we were the biggest. But it's really enormous. I mean, it covers all of the health programs. So Medicare, Medicaid, a whole bunch of other programs providing health services and health insurance to people. Indian Health Service, they're providing health services to tribal members, but also a very significant set of functions involving regulating the healthcare system. So the Affordable Care Act put into the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services a big responsibility for regulating private insurance that hadn't existed in HHS before in the same way. So there's also that. There's also regulating food and drugs and medical devices. So you the entire FDA is within HHS. The civil rights function for all the dollars given out by the federal government in health programs, but also the very substantial human services programs. So what used to be AFDC is now temporary assistance for needy families, still a very substantial amount of money going to states to provide for poor people. LIHEAP, the Low Income Heating Assistance Program, also run by HHS. One of the very significant functions of HHS that general counsels always end up spending a lot of time on is the Office for Refugee Resettlement, which runs the refugee program, but more significantly in terms of money and time and everything else, runs the program providing for unaccompanied migrant children who come to the United States, providing care and treatment for those children while their immigration proceedings are happening. Enormously significant. But basically, if you're thinking about any domestic program that is providing services to people that's not education or housing, and even honestly, some of those, it's within HHS. So it's sprawling, it's enormous. And all of those programs create distinct legal issues. Some are legal issues about giving out money. Some are legal issues about how you take care of people. Some are legal issues about regulation of important economic actors. A lot of very significant administrative law questions, but also constitutional questions, also statutory questions, budget law questions. All of this comes up. So it's really sprawling. When I was general counsel of the Office of Management and Budget in the first year and a half of the Biden administration, I used to say, well, my job is really everything the government does. And it's true, it was everything the government does. And I felt like I had to be 98,000 miles wide and a quarter-inch deep on every legal question. And I moved to HHS and thought, well, this is great because I can really dive deep into stuff. And it turns out it's almost as wide, but people were expecting me to be a lot deeper. So, yeah.
So with that really broad portfolio, and you were there for 2.5 years, just about, is there one project that maybe stands out from your time there?
I mean, the project we worked on together is one of the most significant, creating for the first time a program to negotiate the prices of drugs in Medicare. This had been a long-standing goal. Drug prices were a major, are a major complaint of people people on Medicare, the way Medicare, the Medicare drug program was set up in 2003. It was, set up under President George W. Bush in a very conservative way, very, I would say free market, but really shoving a lot of money at private actors' way, very much designed not to allow the government to use its negotiating power to try to lower the cost of prescription drugs. And so as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, President Biden's signature piece of legislation, we were able to get this program to negotiate the price of drugs in Medicare for the first time. Well, it turns out that's really complex, and it would be complex sort of no matter what, because our system for health insurance and pharmaceuticals is itself incredibly complex. And then when you layer on top of that Medicare itself, that adds another layer of complexity. And then the very messed up way we do drug price or drug insurance in Medicare, Medicare Part D, adds enormous layers of complexity. So already, like, you're trying to figure out how to make all these different complex systems interact. And then you add the fact that our legislative system is deeply messed up. So the only way to get a law like this passed is through budget reconciliation, a process we're seeing the Trump administration go through right now with their sort of signature law, their tax cut law, which is also going to cut Medicaid very substantially and do many other things. That's the only way to get a law passed without getting 60 votes in the Senate, is to use the reconciliation process, which requires satisfying this very arcane piece of law called the Byrd Rule, which basically requires the law to be only about budget things in a very specific way. And what that ends up meaning is lots of the stuff that you would like to have in the law to explain how the law is going to be implemented or to resolve the questions of how the law is going to be implemented, you can't include because the parliamentarian will sustain a point of order against them. So we had integrating all these complex systems, and then we had a law that actually couldn't, by the nature of the process it went through, answer the relevant questions. Oh, and by the way, we're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry that we're regulating. And we're talking about, basically old people and people who are vulnerable in other ways getting or not getting medication that they rely on to live. So it's incredibly high stakes. Yeah, so that was like, a degree of difficulty on a scale of 1 to 10, degree of difficulty 11, right? And so, yeah, that was, super hard, but super fun. We got to work with a great team. I mean, Rachel was a huge part of it, but there were a number of other really terrific lawyers, but also really terrific public servants in the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services who set up the program. And then as we were implementing it, like trying to figure out how to implement it, yeah, that was great. So, I mean, I could name a few other signature things we did, but that was like one of the hardest, most interesting things I've ever worked on. When I was in the Obama administration, I was part of a human rights related thing, and Harold Koh, who was the sort of our leader on that stuff, he was the legal advisor for the State Department. So like the general counsel of the State Department at the time, said to a group of us who were working on it, you don't get that many opportunities in a legal career to participate in an architectural moment where you're really building something, and you should really savor it. And I've had the opportunity to work on a few such things. The drug price negotiation was definitely one of them.
And I always appreciate the ways in which so many parts of the Office of the General Counsel are, if the work is done well and successfully, it's hidden in some ways. So I remember seeing, for example, when the mifepristone oral argument went to the Supreme Court, there was a picture in maybe the Times or the Washington Post of then FDA Commissioner Califf coming out of the Supreme Court after the oral argument, and the picture said, "Oh, Commissioner Califf coming out of the court," and you were right there next to him. And of course, it's not mentioned in the paper, but that's a big part of, right, all the different things that you do. And so I so appreciate being able to be part of the agency and just that one small piece of things, but the breadth of the work that the agency does, it's so hard to overstate.
So many really interesting and important things to do. Yeah.
Now we've got a lot of students here in the room, and those who are in my health law class or my FDA law class know that there's a lot going on. And I'm not going to ask you to go down a whole list of everything going on. I don't think we have time for that. But if there are particular important developments at HHS or within health law more generally, is there a couple of things to highlight?
I mean, so the biggest thing going on, of course, is just the gutting of state capacity, which, we're seeing with the mass firings and, really ill-considered reorganizations at HHS, which I think it's just going to make it impossible for them to do their jobs. And we're seeing that focused particularly on the research arms. So NIH is getting gutted, on some of the public health regulatory agencies, particularly CDC, but also FDA in a very significant way, where they've experienced massive job cuts. And also there's a prospect of very significant reorganization, which promises to essentially de-insulate the decision makers who had been making drug and device and other approval decisions from political interference. One of the things that FDA in particular had worked on really hard through the years is establishing a strong reputation as an agency that could be trusted to follow the facts. And obviously, look, we all know every significant decision made by a government agency, is inflected with your values and the values of the people who run the agency, and that's inherently political. But it's important for consumers who are relying on FDA decisions about, what drugs are safe, to be able to trust that at least the factual underpinnings of FDA decisions are the best possible factual underpinnings. They rely on the best evidence available. They rely on the latest science. They rely on techniques that can be defended. And we're seeing very concerning statements coming out of folks who used to be there, including Peter Marks, who was the head of the Biologics Center, so that dealt with vaccines, but also biologic drugs, where he suggested that he's made now a couple of suggestions in public interviews that he had been pressured to essentially provide facts that didn't exist, or provide a means to change the factual record. That's something that would be terrible for consumers and also the pharmaceutical industry, because people wouldn't trust the decisions of FDA. So that's really more institutional than legal. I think the legal things that we're looking for right now, it's hard to say, right? I mean, a lot of it is we're seeing very significant legal challenges to the legal developments of the Biden administration. So efforts by the Biden administration to regulate nursing homes more aggressively just got invalidated yesterday, I guess, by our friend Judge Kaczmarek in Amarillo, Texas. We've seen efforts by the Biden administration to regulate certain kinds of tests by FDA also getting invalidated. So we're seeing that sort of thing happen legally. I think we're really waiting for what a Trump administration is going to do to change the law. We know they're going to attack various efforts to expand HIPAA protections for reproductive health. We know they're going to attack various efforts to expand civil rights protections, particularly on LGBTQ rights, but probably in general. But, you know, the shoe hasn't dropped on that yet.
And one of the points that you started by making is about state capacity and the people who are being fired all across HHS. You know, as I was saying, you were my boss, really my boss's boss, right? There were many levels when I was at OGC, and I can't say enough good things about the career civil servants who work in that department. Can you say something? Can you help the students understand the perspective of someone who chooses to spend their career working for these federal programs, working for the American people?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that has made our government work well when it works well is that we have developed a very professional career civil service, you know, of people. And I've worked in 3 federal agencies. I worked at DOJ, I worked at OMB, and I worked at HHS. And at every one of those places, the overwhelming majority of the people who worked there were career civil servants. They were people who went to work for the government, to make the government work. And it was really important to them and to their ethos that they stayed across administrations. Didn't matter what party they were from or what party the new administration was from. Their job was to provide competent services, competent professional services to support the lawful objectives of whatever administration was in office. And so, you know, you had people, I mean, I walked into OMB on Inauguration Day 2021. And, you know, on Inauguration Day, one of the first things I did, I was responsible for managing the executive order process in the White House. That's one of the jobs of the OMB General Counsel. One of our day one executive orders was taking down the border wall. And I had career staff working for me on January 21, 2021, who on January 19th, 2021, were working as hard as possible to build a border wall. And on January 21, 2 days later, we're working as hard as possible to take down the border wall because that was their job. And I don't know what their real views were about that. They didn't bring that to the job. And that's actually really important. Now, you know, I picked the border wall just because A, it's a thing I spent a lot of time on when I was at OMB, but B, it's a very, you know, salient political issue where it's clear it divides the parties. But just the normal day-to-day of government, you know, you need people who work over years to develop expertise in how government works and how these programs work. And, you know, what you find at a place like HHS, which, you know, up until like when I left had 80-something thousand employees, you find people who are the absolute expert in how an obscure but incredibly important part of the healthcare system works. That you're not going to be able to provide people their prescription drugs if you don't have folks who understand how this healthcare system works and this part of the healthcare system works. And if you just go willy-nilly firing those folks, then whatever you're trying to do, you know, whatever the people vote for, whatever policies the people are supporting, they're not going to be well implemented because you won't have the people who have the knowledge and the experience to actually put them into place. And so that's why it matters so much. And you end up working with these folks who they could be working for private industry, making 3 times what they're making easily. And the reason why they're not doing it is not because, as Elon Musk thinks, well, they can't do anything more productive. It's because they want to serve the public, and they don't want to serve the public, in ways like I have. Like, I started out as a career government employee. I really liked doing that, but I stopped doing that after a few years because I realized I have ideological projects I want to implement. And so the jobs that I wanted were the leadership type jobs, working as a political appointee. They don't want those jobs, the folks in these career civil service positions. And they don't feel like they're doing the same thing. What they want to be doing is just making government work. They believe in government. They believe in serving the people. And, I just have great honor and respect for that. And I wish, more people did.
And so you mentioned we were engaged in, you called it an architectural project, right? Building this drug price negotiation program. It hadn't existed before. There weren't people who knew how it worked because it hadn't been there. But there were people who had built the Medicare Part D program. There were people who had built the inflation rebate program in Medicaid and had thought about how to adapt it to the Medicare context, right? The deep expertise that existed within the department. It's tough to think about how some of the work would have been accomplished without that.
Absolutely. I mean, right. I mean, I can think of any number of questions that came up about how we were going to implement the Medicare drug price negotiation program. And, when we were just trying to conceptualize answers, we could, there were various people with various interests pushing various particular answers on us. How were we going to think about how those would work? Well, we could listen to the folks who were self-interested, who were pushing them. We could stare into our navels and think, well, I don't know, how do I think it would work? And, the higher you get up the chain, the more navel gazing you get, actually, and the more sort of reflexive answers you get from folks. These are very busy people who have a lot on their plate. And so and they're very smart, and they got to where they are because they're smart and have good judgment and can make quick decisions. And, maybe that describes how I think of myself too. But what you need is the folks who say, but hold on a second, this thing that's being proposed actually looks a lot like this other idea that we tried to implement in this analogous program, and here's how it went awry. And so maybe you don't want to do it here, or maybe if you do want to do it here, you want to take the lessons that we learned from this. And without the people with that kind of experience, nobody's going to be giving you the information you need to actually make the decision.
Mm-hmm. And to make the program work.
Yep.
Yeah. And so we've mostly been talking about the executive branch. You've mentioned Congress briefly in the context of reconciliation. You've noted, hey, Congress is trying to do another reconciliation bill right now that could have potentially large impacts on Medicaid, especially. What potential changes to Medicaid are you watching for? And what potential impacts, if Congress is successful, do you see for beneficiaries, for healthcare professionals?
Yeah, I mean, so the biggest changes to be watching for Medicaid are, number one, a substantial gutting of Medicaid expansion, the Medicaid expansion from the Affordable Care Act. Probably the way that's going to be accomplished is through, something that's going to be sold as parity. So right now, for the Medicaid expansion population, the federal government pays 90% of the cost. And that was important to enticing states to sign up for it. For the rest of Medicaid, depending on how rich the state is, basically the federal government pays between 50% and 80-something% of the cost. And the idea would be to apply that same match rate from traditional Medicaid to Medicaid expansion. What that would mean is that for the overwhelming majority of states that are in Medicaid expansion, they wouldn't be able to afford it anymore. And so they'd probably just drop out of Medicaid expansion. There's pretty much no way to hit the target that the Republicans in Congress have set for themselves for this reconciliation bill without doing that. So I fully expect that's a big part of what they're going to do. I think we're also going to see work requirements being imposed on Medicaid and much more broadly, certainly on Medicaid expansion, but probably much more broadly than that. There's a lot of evidence about work requirements in Medicaid. Basically, everyone who can work, who's on Medicaid, is working. And so what work requirements do is they impose administrative burden that knocks people off Medicaid without actually creating a real incentive to work. And again, a lot of evidence about this. We will see. I suspect those will be adopted too and be made mandatory on states. That will save a certain amount of money. Other things we might see are actually, I said the match rate goes between 50 and 80 something percent. I think we might see that 50% floor get dropped to 40%. And that would affect about 10 states, overwhelmingly blue states, by the way, and the District of Columbia. And so I think that's something we could easily see as well. A little less likely to see that one, but I think we're overwhelmingly likely to see the other two.
I hope my health law students feel vindicated every time I do a health law on the news and I say, this is about FMAP, and that's better. All right, good. So maybe I'll stick to one more question before we open it up to questions from the audience. So what advice would you give to young lawyers, law students who are interested in careers in health law and any of the fields that would be within HHS's ambit?
Yeah, I mean, so I think number one, that there are lots of opportunities to work in these fields. People focus a lot on the federal government, understandably. I've worked in the federal government. I love it. Obviously, this is a very fraught moment for jobs in the federal government. But even before this moment, I was saying the thing that I'm about to say to you, which is that there are lots of really interesting and very sophisticated and very impactful opportunities in state and local government, in health and in social services. And in all sorts of things that governance is relevant to. People, and I've been saying this probably since I was on the faculty here, Karen may have heard me say this before. People are always looking for the federal government jobs. I get it. I've also worked in state and local government, and those are often places where you can make the most difference, because if you are smart and engaged, you can pick up a project and really carry it to completion in a way that when you're a small cog in a big machine, you can't as easily. And those are the places where you often have the most direct impact on the people who are being served by programs. Those are places where new ideas are developed and end up, getting tested out and eventually scaled up nationally. So big pitch for state and local government from my perspective. I think in general, also a thing I would say just to law students about how you're thinking about your career is you should recognize the world is going to be very different, even 5 years from the time you graduate, than you can imagine. And it's going to be even more different 10 and 15 and 20 and 30 years later. I was saying beforehand, I graduated law school 32 years ago. I never would have guessed that I would have done the things that I did. Some of the things that I've done didn't exist as areas of the law when I went to law school. I have become one of the leading experts on the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was not a law when I went to law school. But also, I just wouldn't have known that I wouldn't have known I would do so much, negotiation. Like I wouldn't have known that being an in-house lawyer was a thing that I loved doing and, spent some real time doing. And when I left, it made me really unhappy and I want to do it again, I wouldn't have known that I would have worked so much on immigration related areas of the law. So part of what I would say to people as a pitch is not only should you prepare yourself psychologically for the fact that your career is going to shift around in ways you can't predict, but you should prepare yourself intellectually for that. And you should prepare yourself for that in your classes. Don't just be focused on here are the classes that are going to help me in job number 1 or job number 2. But here are classes that are going to help me think about the world as it changes. Because you're really preparing yourselves for a career, not a job, and for a life.
So that's a wonderful recommendation about being open to experiences and learning new skills and using law school maybe as a chance to learn some of those experiences and to have some wonderful opportunities. So I'm happy to open it up for questions now. I'm sure there's a number in the audience. And should I keep the cue? Or do you-
Stand up and make sure people can hear you behind you.
So I think you talked a couple times about like these massive, like, architectural moments for a lawyer to be able to make like a big new policy. But, we're 78 days in, we don't know how many, other massive changes will happen. So how do you think we could meet that even bigger architectural moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I really do think sort of increasingly that no matter what happens at this point, to decelerate what's going on in Washington, we have reached a point where we're not going to just fix things around the edges. We're not going to go back to the world as it existed, even on January 19th. When there is a new administration, and there will be a new administration, it is going to have to rebuild and build something that is new, not just go back to the old plans. And so the scale of that is going to be enormous. In some ways, I was saying earlier, I've been really lucky to work on a number of architectural projects. All of you are going to have the opportunity, lucky or unlucky, I'll let you decide, but all of you are going to have the opportunity to work on something very significantly architectural in whatever area you're working on, if it has to do with the governance of this country. Because we are seeing the state as we know it being destroyed, and the new state has not yet been conceptualized, much less built. It's not like these folks came in with a plan and, we're going to, I don't know how many Star Trek fans we have here, we're going to take the Genesis machine and we're going to destroy all the existing life and then regrow new life here. It's just more the first half of it, right? We're going to destroy the existing institutions. And then who knows what comes next? We'll play it by ear. I mean, that seems to be sort of the strategy, such as it is. That's going to create an enormous opportunity, not one I would have welcomed or wanted, but one I think we have to seize. So I think, keeping your eyes open and focusing on like, what are the areas where there feels like an opportunity to actually contribute to building something new and good, and then jumping in there. That's the most I can say to you right now about that, but I think there will be those opportunities.
Somebody in the back, jump up. So there's a significant portion of the population, or at least this portion of the population is being catered to politically significantly, that just doesn't trust experts for existing institutions. And they may have at one point been more fringe, but it is really at the forefront politically. And I think that both of you would have, you know, as academics and also working as experts in many different fields, be in a position to answer the question of how do you regain their trust, which I feel is necessary to have a functioning democratic process.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, you know, you have identified sort of the fundamental political policy governance problem of our moment, right? Which is we have this incredible distrust of all established institutions, you know, which can lead to an almost nihilistic politics, you know, and I think we are seeing that, and we're seeing the results of that. We're seeing the embodiment of that. And, you know, there are a lot of causes for it, some of which go back a very long way. And I think, you know, say a lot about kind of austerity politics starting in the 1970s. You know, I live in Michigan, so I see up close, you know, I've spent a lot of time in my life in UAW union halls, honestly, and I see up close just this incredible distrust with the intellectuals who said, well, if we had freer trade, you know, it would be good for everybody. Well, it turned out all these people lost their, you know, good jobs. And so that's why we have people today responding to tariffs that are, you know, in some ways deeply ill-considered and going to be horrible for the economy, saying, well, it can't be any worse than what we experienced, you know. And I actually, in the last week, talked to people who have said that. You know, we saw that in, you know, we've seen that in the way people respond to the institutions of the healthcare system, whether it's health insurers. I think the, you know, support for Luigi Mangione, you know, who committed a horrible act, but, you know, got a lot of support because people hate insurance companies, you know, is one example of that. But I think same thing with public health entities and the way people respond to COVID, you know, where there's just a lot that people felt like public health officials were not leveling with them. And in many cases, that was true. You know, there was a lot of paternalism coming from public health officials. So like all of this leads to, and, you know, universities like, and that have built these beautiful campuses while raising tuition substantially and imposing debt burdens on people, right? Like all of this creates an anti-institutional politics. And the only way that government can work and that we can do the things we need government for, right? I mean, nihilistic politics, anarchistic politics, they don't work for people. We have the institutions of government we have because we can't do alone certain things, including protecting against infectious disease, you know, including providing for people who can't take care of themselves, including protecting the environment, protecting people against predation in the market. Right? We need government to do these things, but government can't do these things if people don't trust institutions. Institutions have to rebuild that trust. How do we do that? I mean, I think that is a big part of the architectural moment that we're facing right now. I don't know. Like, I mean, I know, I feel like I know certain granular answers to that, but I think if we're not focused very significantly on how do our institutions rebuild trust, none of this stuff's going to work.
Somebody over here. I have a question. Let her in the back and then you. Speak up if you would.
So 1988, right, when I graduated from high school, was the first time that women were allowed to have a credit card in their name. And I think a large part of this is people think this stuff's happened so long ago.
Yep.
I'm only 54. Like, it wasn't that long ago, right? So I, also, the thing is, that I see, I was a former regional advocate, left on the 19th of the government, and I agree with you, I'm so incensed for the people who got let go, as if they could not put their political ideology aside to do their job. So I am angry for them, because there were some great people who I certainly did not agree with politically, but they did their job. So my question for you all is, how do we get people to think critically? Because that's what I see, quite frankly, a lot, is people are not thinking past the thing that's just thrown in their face. So I graduated from high school, I had to take a civics class. Like, we had to know the basic process of the government. If I talk to people nowadays, 30 and under, they have no clue how the government even works. So how do we get people to think critically? Is it the academics' responsibility to get their folks to think beyond just the thing that's thrown in front of them?
I wish I knew the answer to that question. I mean, it's a very good question. I'm not sure I have any insight into, unfortunately.
One here, and then I'll take Tim.
Well, thank you for being here. My question is, I have a lot of like non-law student friends who call me. They kind of are looking for maybe they're reading the news. They're looking for kind of me to provide them with light at the end of the tunnel. And I honestly don't know what to say to them. So I was kind of wondering maybe what you say to non-law students or lawyers when they come to you with similar concerns.
Yeah, so I didn't hear precisely the concern though. So what's,
Well, they're just reading the news and looking at the,
Yeah.
they're reacting to it, but they're not necessarily reading it with the lens of a lawyer or a law student. And so I think they're coming to me kind of like, how do you interpret this? And I don't really have much to tell them. So
well, I think there's a degree to which everyone's in that position, because, you know, what is going on in Washington is happening with incredible speed, and is almost certainly, if not certainly, violating various kinds of legal restrictions. Not everything that I disagree with that's happening right now is violating the law, but I think there's a lot of violation of the law out there. But, you know, I think that we have lost the legal discourse outside of the courts that we used to have. So there's this very court-focused thought about the law that, you know, it's the courts that are going to decide whether there's a violation of law. Let's let people sue and let's figure that out. And, you know, I think people have ignored or forgotten or come to forget that the courts are very limited in what they can do. They decide discrete cases. You know, they decide disputes between particular parties. They have lots of doctrines that lead them to try to stay out of what look like political fights. And, you know, we have a judiciary that is constructed as part of a political process too. And so I think we need much more. This is not giving you the answer, because I think the answer for any questions people are giving you is, you know, to really look at the particular thing that they're coming to you upset about and kind of examine the legal issues surrounding that. But I think what we have lost is this idea that it's not just on the courts to articulate and adhere to the law, but it's also on the executive branch. We have an executive branch right now that has made clear they don't feel like they need to be bound by what Congress says. I think that's a fundamentally, you know, that's a fundamental challenge to our constitutional democracy. And we have leaders in Congress who have abandoned any effort to make the legal case to the public about why the laws they've adopted matter or the constitutional separation of powers matters. And I think that leads to a very thin and arid kind of understanding of what law is and particularly our constitutional system is. And, it wasn't always that way. And I think it would be easier to be having these conversations if we weren't all just waiting for what the court said to tell us what the law is. But we were having a much more robust argument, and our leaders in Congress were having a much more robust argument about why what's going on is not lawful, and using the tools they have to advance that argument.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you a question about the courts, but now I'm not going to. So, since all three of us have worked in HHS, maybe there's others, I'm gonna ask you a different question. When people are focused in on cabinet level appointments, and you haven't mentioned his name, but I told people, don't pay that much attention to the secretary, pay attention to the undersecretaries and those people within the agency, because they're really important. And so my question is, do you have any insights that you're willing to share about what's going on under the secretary level and that we really need to be paying attention to? Those things are kind of hard to follow out here in the middle of the country, because I think all the layoffs and stuff are happening, but I don't have a good sense of what's happening at the assistant secretary level and all that, because I think that's going to be really important.
Right, and then there's this other dynamic of how much does it matter what the deputy secretary, assistant secretary, the administrator of CMS, the FDA commissioner, how much does it matter what they think, and how much does it matter what the White House thinks? And certainly, in the Biden administration, there was a constant push and pull between the appointees in the agencies, even presidential appointees like me in the agencies, and the White House. And I sort of saw it from both sides, because I was in the White House at OMB, and then I was at HHS. And everybody in the White House always thinks they run everything. And I mean, that's true in every administration. It was probably more true, it was probably more correct in the Biden administration than it was in the Obama administration, two administrations I served in agencies as a political appointee in. I think right now, an enormous amount of what's happening at HHS and all of the agencies is coming out of the White House, and particularly the Elon Musk piece of the White House. And so that's really where the power is at the moment. But I think you see the imprint of RFK and of some of his underlings who are, to be fair, much newer in their jobs than he is, on some decisions, right? So I think you see RFK in the vaccine stuff. I don't think Elon Musk cares about the vaccine stuff. I don't think Donald Trump cares about the vaccine stuff, but I think it's clear that's the priority of RFK. And so that's why you're seeing, we're gonna do research into whether vaccines cause autism. Well, I mean, we know the answer to that question. We don't need more research into it. We see folks going to Peter Marks before he quit and saying, we need you to show us the evidence you have that the measles vaccine causes these side effects. What do you mean? The evidence I have, there's no such evidence, right? And so I think that's an RFK level thing. I think we're seeing in some of the personnel decisions at NIH, a lot of the people who are getting fired or demoted or reassigned at the level just below the head of NIH are people who the new NIH director has some personal / professional beef with. And so I think you're seeing that. I don't know, it's going to take a while before we see the folks at that level actually implement their own policy ideas. We're seeing, I've talked about the Office for Refugee Resettlement. We're seeing that has basically been taken over by DHS and ICE, even though Congress specifically put the Office for Refugee Resettlement in the Department of Health and Human Services, so it would not be part of HHS. It would not be an immigration enforcement agency, but we're seeing it become much more integrated into immigration enforcement. You know, that's in part about the person who is running ORR, but it's also very significantly about Stephen Miller in the White House. So I think you have to think about all these different power centers when you're thinking about the executive branch.
Maybe one.
Can I make
small
one more, I know
comment.
something about classifieds, or anybody got a burning question? We can jump. Otherwise, we jump in.
So my question is, it seems like a lot of these things that the administration is doing will in some way, shape or form hurt the base of people that voted them. It's often significantly. Will that at all, do you think that will have any movement in terms of people's opinion, or because of this anti-institutionalism, they'll see it as a product of somebody else that isn't the current administration, or do you have any thoughts or guesses, especially related to like Medicare, Medicaid, that seems like a pretty significant one in terms of people that's harm, on how that might make any difference?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, you're gonna see rural hospitals close, and, you know, the rural vote was very significantly in favor of this administration. You know, just as an example for Medicaid, but, yeah, I don't know. I'm not a political pundit that way, so I don't really know the answer to that. I think a lot of people are gonna be hurt by these policies, including people who did and people who didn't vote for the folks who are currently in office. And I think that's, you know, regardless of how they voted, I think it's, you know, from my perspective, you know, we had gotten to a place that was far from ideal with healthcare in the United States, but that was far better than when I was growing up, than when I was in college and law school. And, you know, a lot of the gains that we've made, we've already lost, and a lot more are threatened. And, you know, I used to say, I mean, Rachel has probably heard me say it a million times when I was at HHS and I was talking to our staff at the Office of General Counsel. I was like, and what I would say to them is like, your job matters because of you, people live longer and better lives, you know, and yeah, like you may think what you're doing is figuring out how to apply the federal acquisition regulation to this particular thing, but it's all part of a much bigger project that means that people live longer and better lives. And when we roll that back, people live shorter and worse lives, you know, and I find it incredibly difficult emotionally to deal with that. You know, we're in a place, it's not that there's just a difference of opinion about how best to implement the goal. It's that we're destroying the state for the sake of destroying the state. And the result is going to be that people live shorter and worse lives.
And one of the challenges is that we and many of the people in this room can see it coming, right? So something I've said a lot to those of you in my health law classes, we're looking at the enhanced ACA tax credits to expire at the end of this year. I don't think people know that for tens of millions of people next year, their health insurance is going to cost a lot more. Many of them may drop coverage, to say nothing of the potential impacts on Medicaid that we've already talked about, to say nothing about the current proposed rule that would impact other ACA enrollees. There's a lot going on simultaneously that's going to have pretty short-term direct impacts on people, and I don't think people know it's coming.
Well, I think.
On that happy note.
Oh man, so sorry.
We all, being able to share the expertise with somebody like Sam, to get us to think a little bit harder. And there's a certain amount of equanimity or optimism that you can see, even in somebody who's this close to it, that there will be some architectural challenges and changes and improvements to be made, and that we're all going to be a part of that as long as we just, you know, keep on pushing, and listening to people like Sam. So join me in thanking these folks.